She tightly held the pearl necklace, the last valuable thing left from her once magnificent home. Philadelphia's busy streets felt strange to a woman who had almost never left her plantation. The North's fast pace, the noise, the sight of all sorts of people moving freely together, it all made her uneasy. She had come north because she had no choice, and every step on the strange stone paths reminded her of how low she had fallen. She walked towards the jeweler's shop. Her dress, once beautiful, was now faded and patched. Her gloves were torn at the tips. The cool autumn wind cut through her thin shawl, another memory of the comforts she no longer had. She had been a widow for 3 years, and the war had taken everything else, her enslaved workers, her land, her place in society. "I won't take less than $50, she whispered, practicing her speech as she reached the shop's shiny door. "This belonged to my grandmother, a very important woman in Charleston society. The pearls are real salt water from before the Revolution." The practiced speech sounded weak even to her own ears, but her pride was all she had left. Elizabeth stood straighter, putting on the air of the plantation mistress she used to be. Her hand reached for the brass doorknob, but before she could grab it, the shop door opened. A well-dressed black man stepped out, adjusting his fine leather gloves. His suit was perfectly made, and his boots shone like glass. He walked with the confidence of someone used to respect, the kind Elizabeth had only seen in rich white men from her husband's circle. Their eyes met. For a moment, Elizabeth saw only a successful stranger blocking her way until recognition lit up his gaze. Those eyes, she knew them. They had once been kept low in her presence, careful never to look at her directly. The eyes of a boy who had served in her house, who had stood quietly in corners waiting for orders, who had grown up under her roof, but whose thoughts she had never once cared about. Now they held her steadily with a strong focus that made her step back. There was no difference in them, only sharp knowing and something else, a careful judgment that suddenly made her feel exposed. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, his voice deep and strong, educated in a way she didn't remember. He removed his hat, a polite gesture, while his eyes stayed fixed on hers. What an unexpected surprise! Elizabeth's throat tightened. She struggled to remember which of the dozens of enslaved people her husband had owned he was. This man was a stranger, yet familiar in a way that troubled her. "I'm Solomon Freeman now," he continued, noticing her confusion with a slight curl of his lip. "No longer the boy you called Sam, who polished your silver and suffered your husband's whip, the boy who brought your tea every morning and whom you once had whipped for breaking your favorite china cup." The memory rushed back, the delicate handle snapping in her hand, her rage, her husband's cold command. She had watched from the window, telling herself it was necessary discipline. The boy had been 13. Elizabeth's pearls slipped from her shaking fingers, scattering over the stone path like tears. She dropped to her knees right away, desperately trying to catch the precious beads as they rolled toward the street drain. Her whole world narrowed to those pearls, her last link to who she had been, to the life that was gone. A polished boot stepped into her line of sight. Solomon bent down, not to help her, but to pick up a single pearl that had rolled near his foot. He held it up to the light, looking at it with the knowing eye of someone who understood its worth. "Still giving orders with those eyes of yours, Mrs. Hargrove?" he asked quietly. "Still expecting the world to bow before you? Things have changed since we last met." Elizabeth stayed on her knees, frozen between keeping her dignity and her desperate need. Around them, people passing by stared at the unusual sight, a white woman kneeling before a black man who stood tall above her. What Solomon did next would shake Elizabeth to her very core. Solomon held out his hand, not to help Elizabeth rise, but to drop the pearl into his pocket with deliberate slowness, making sure she watched it disappear. "Considerate payment," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of an educated man, not the southern sound he had carefully hidden during his years in slavery. "1 pearl for 10 years, for a decade of unpaid service. I'd say that's rather fair accounting, wouldn't you?" Elizabeth stared up at him, her face burning with shame. The busy Philadelphia street kept going around them, uncaring of her distress. Several people slowed to watch the strange scene, a white woman on her knees before a well-dressed black man. In Virginia, such a sight would have brought immediate help. Here, it only brought curious looks. "You can't, that's stealing," she stammered, her fingers shaking as she gathered the remaining scattered pearls. "That necklace is my property, my mother, before me." "Property," Solomon repeated, the word hanging between them like a sharp knife. "An interesting choice of words from you, Mrs. Hargrove." His eyes narrowed slightly. I recall your husband using that very term when discussing me with possible buyers when I was 16. Fine property, he called me. Strong back, quick mind. If not for the latter, he'd be perfect. Elizabeth flinched at the memory. That had been just before Thomas Hargrove decided to keep Sam Solomon instead of selling him, not out of kindness, but because her husband realized the boy's intelligence could be used for his own financial gain, making him manage records and letters. Solomon gestured to a young black boy passing with newspapers under his arm. "You there? Fetch the constable. This woman is harassing me on the public street." The boy nodded and ran off, weaving through the crowd. Elizabeth quickly stood up, clutching the remaining pearls so tightly the edges dug into her palm. Her heart pounded with real fear, a new feeling for a woman who had spent her life protected by wealth and status. "You wouldn't dare," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Solomon adjusted his gloves without rush. "The world has changed, Mrs. Hargrove. In Philadelphia, my word matters. I am known to judges and businessmen alike. You are—" His gaze swept over her faded dress, the worn shawl, the scuffed shoes that had once been fine leather. "Considerably less known. A Southern refugee with no connections, no references, and a clear accent that shows you've come from a defeated nation." The threat hung in the air between them, clear as the autumn light. Elizabeth glanced down the street, half expecting to see the police approaching. She had no friends here, no one to speak up for her. The realization of her complete vulnerability struck her hard. Then, unexpectedly, Solomon's expression changed. The hardness in his eyes softened, not to warmth, but to something more calculating. "But unlike some I could name, I understand the concept of mercy." He reached into his coat's inner pocket and pulled out a calling card, cream-colored and stamped with gold writing. "Tomorrow, my office, 300 precisely. Perhaps we can discuss a position for you." "A position?" Elizabeth's voice cracked on the words, her Southern pride fighting back even as desperation gripped her. "I am not seeking charity from a former slave." "No," Solomon finished, his tone gentle but his eyes sharp. "You're merely selling family treasures on the street, much more dignified." He gestured to the scattered pearls, some still rolling toward the gutter. "Gather your property, Mrs. Hargrove. Tomorrow we'll discuss your future." As he turned to leave, Elizabeth grabbed his sleeve without thinking. "Why would you help me after everything?" Solomon looked pointedly at her hand until she released his coat. "Who said anything about helping you?" he replied quietly. "I merely offered a position. Whether it benefits you remains to be seen." He tipped his hat, a gentleman's gesture done with perfect correctness that still felt like a mock, and walked away, his stride confident and steady. Elizabeth watched him go, noticing how other people made way for him, how a white businessman nodded hello, how a pair of ladies smiled as he passed. Only when he had disappeared around a corner did Elizabeth bend to get the last of her pearls from the dirty street. As she did, she noticed the stamped writing on his card: Solomon Freeman, Esquire, Attorney at Law. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet as she realized. This man now held power over her future in ways she could not yet grasp. In her rented attic room that evening, Elizabeth walked the worn floorboards, the calling card turning over and over in her fingers. The room was clean but simple: a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a washstand with a cracked mirror, a small table with one chair. The slanted ceiling forced her to duck near the walls, a constant physical reminder of her reduced life. Working for Solomon Freeman was unthinkable. Taking orders from a man who had once been property, her property, the very idea went against everything she had been taught to believe. Yet her last money had paid for this room for 2 weeks, and the remaining pearls, even if she could get a good price for them, wouldn't last long. She removed her worn gloves and looked at her hands in the fatting light. They were no longer the soft white hands of a plantation mistress. The past 3 years had left them rough, the nails short and simple, small calluses forming where she had taken up needle and thread to mend her own clothes, tasks once done by enslaved women whose names she now struggled to recall. Memories rushed back unbidden. The boy Sam bringing her breakfast tray each morning, eyes carefully looking down. The time she had caught him looking at a book in the library and instead of reporting him had secretly taught him letters. The terrible day of the whipping when her husband found out the boy was writing and she had turned away instead of stepping in. Had she shown him kindness or merely less cruelty than others? And what did Solomon Freeman want from her now? Revenge, justice, or something else entirely? Elizabeth opened her small purse and took out the string of pearls, now missing one. She counted them, 23 remaining, and laid them on the small table. Each one represented a possible meal, a week's lodging, a step away from complete poverty. But without contacts, without references, how long could she survive in this northern city that viewed her accent with suspicion? She had written to cousins in Richmond, to former friends in Charleston, but their replies, when they came at all, expressed sympathy without offering help. The war had made many poor. Those who kept wealth had little to spare for a widow whose husband had gambled away much of his fortune even before the conflict began. As darkness fell, Elizabeth lit her single candle and sat on the edge of the bed. Pride demanded she throw Solomon's card into the fire. Survival whispered that she couldn't afford such gestures. Tomorrow at 3:00, she would discover what happens when the powerless become powerful, and those who once commanded must learn to obey. She closed her eyes, remembering the boy who had stood silently in the corner of her parlor, waiting for orders. Had there been signs even then of the man he would become? Had she simply been too blind to see them? Or had she seen and chosen to ignore the intelligence in those carefully lowered eyes? Elizabeth clutched the pearls to her chest and allowed herself, for the first time since leaving Virginia, to weep openly for all she had lost, and for all she had never truly possessed. At precisely 5 minutes before 3:00, Elizabeth stood before a handsome brick building on Walnut Street. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the stone paths, and the crisp air carried the scent of coal fires and approaching winter. She had spent the morning washing her hair with her last piece of good soap, styling it in a way that had been popular in Richmond 3 years ago. Her hands, now bare of gloves too worn to be presentable, clutched a small purse holding her remaining pearls and Solomon Freeman's card. A polished brass sign beside the door read, "Freeman and Associates, Attorneys at Law." The building itself was simple compared to the grand law offices of Virginia, but well-kept and respectable, the firm of a successful professional, not a desperate newcomer. Elizabeth smoothed her dress, her second best, saved for church and important events, and adjusted her bonnet before climbing the steps. Each movement was careful, practiced, the ritual of a woman who once commanded respect just by walking into a room. She paused at the door, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the handle. Through the glass, she could see movement inside, people working, a business thriving, Solomon's business. The reality of her situation struck her anew, and she almost turned away. But the memory of her cold attic room, the dwindling coins in her purse, steadied her resolve. She straightened her back, lifted her chin, and opened the door. Inside, a young black woman sat at a desk in the reception area, writing in a large book with a practiced hand. The space was warm, brightly lit by large windows, with comfortable chairs for waiting clients and framed papers on the walls. Diplomas and certificates, Elizabeth guessed, though she didn't look closely. The secretary looked up as Elizabeth entered, her expression professionally neutral, neither welcoming nor unfriendly. "Mrs. Hargrove, I presume?" she asked, setting down her pen. Her voice was refined, her speech perfect. "Mr. Freeman is expecting you. This way, please." Elizabeth's surprise must have shown on her face, for the young woman added, "Mr. Freeman described you quite precisely." There was the faintest stress on precisely that made Elizabeth wonder exactly what Solomon had said about her. "Yes, I am Mrs. Hargrove," she confirmed, following the secretary down a short hallway. She noticed the fine furniture, the shelves lined with law books, the subtle signs of wealth everywhere, good carpets, quality oil lamps, a clock that appeared to be genuinely French. The building hummed with quiet work. She saw 2 other offices where clerks bent over documents and heard the murmur of a meeting behind a closed door. The secretary knocked on a door at the end of the hall and announced her, then stepped aside with a small nod that was neither a deep bow nor quite the gesture of equals. Elizabeth hesitated at the doorframe, suddenly aware of her faded dress, her mended shawl, her scuffed shoes that no amount of polish could restore to their former glory. Solomon's office was spacious and well-furnished. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, lighting up a massive desk of polished mahogany where he sat reviewing papers. A low fire burned in the fireplace, keeping away the autumn chill. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with leather-bound volumes. On another wall hung a large map of the United States with the former Confederate states marked in red. Beside it was a framed document that Elizabeth recognized with a shock as an emancipation certificate. Solomon rose as she entered, a courteous gesture that felt strangely confusing. He was dressed flawlessly in a dark gray suit with a silk vest, a gold watch chain gleaming across it. His tie was perfectly knotted and his shoes shone like mirrors. He motioned to a chair placed before his desk. Punctual, he noted, checking the watch he took from his pocket. One of your few good qualities, I recall. Your husband, as I remember, made everyone wait as a rule, a small display of power that cost others their time but protected his sense of importance. The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Thomas Hargrove had indeed made a habit of being late, even for dinner in their own home. Elizabeth had never considered how this might appear to the household staff who stood waiting, unable to continue their duties or take their own meals until the master had been served. "I've come for my pearl, Mr. Freeman," Elizabeth said, remaining standing despite his gesture toward the chair. She would not sit until invited, but neither would she seem too eager to take the subordinate position. Solomon smiled faintly. "Please sit, we have business to discuss." It was not a request, but an order, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "What possible business could we have?" Elizabeth asked, but she took the seat, her body stiff, her purse clutched tightly in her lap. She would not give him the satisfaction of asking again about the pearl. "I find myself in need of someone with your particular knowledge." He closed the document he had been reviewing and set it aside, then opened a drawer and pulled out a folder tied with string. "I represent several freed men and women seeking payment from former masters, stolen property, unpaid wages, children separated and sold away." His eyes met hers, unwavering. "You have intimate knowledge of how plantation households worked. Records were kept, conversations were had, decisions were made behind closed doors." Elizabeth's breath caught. "You want me to testify against my own kind?" "Your kind, Mrs. Hargrove?" Solomon raised an eyebrow. "An interesting choice of words. Do you mean Southerners, plantation owners, or simply white people?" He leaned back slightly in his chair. "I want you to work as my assistant in these cases, to provide your inside knowledge for a fair wage, to help me understand the systems that allowed such unfairness to flourish, so that I might better dismantle them through legal means." He opened the folder, showing a stack of sworn statements and legal papers. "For example, I currently represent a woman seeking to locate her 3 children sold to separate buyers in 1859. The seller claims to have no records of the transactions. I know this to be a lie. All plantation owners kept such records for tax purposes, if nothing else. But proving this in court requires someone who can testify to such practices from within." The truth of his words stung worse than any insult. Elizabeth had indeed seen such record books in her husband's study, had even helped keep them during his frequent absences. She knew exactly how the business of human bondage had been documented, categorized, made legitimate through careful paperwork. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Solomon shrugged, the gesture elegant and dismissive. "Then our business is concluded. Keep your pride. See how well it feeds you." He reached into his vest pocket and removed her pearl, rolling it between his fingers so it caught the light. "Though I wonder how many meals this will buy. Pearls, I understand, have fallen in value since the war. Too many Southern ladies selling family treasures, I suppose." Elizabeth stared at the pearl gleaming in his palm. It represented everything she had lost: her position, her wealth, her certainty in the natural order of things, and perhaps her only chance at survival in this new world that had rejected everything she had once believed. "What exactly would this position involve?" she asked finally, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "You would review documents, help prepare cases, provide context and background information on plantation operations." Solomon set the pearl on the desk between them. "You would receive a modest but fair salary, paid weekly. You would be expected to keep confidentiality regarding our clients and their cases, and you would answer to me, Mrs. Hargrove. I would be your employer and you would be my subordinate. There can be no misunderstanding on that point." He studied her face for a moment. "I do not require you to deny your beliefs or pretend sympathy you do not feel. I require only your knowledge and your competence. Your personal feelings on the matter of slavery, reparations, or the proper order of society are your own." Elizabeth's mind raced. The position offered survival, but at what cost to her dignity? Yet what dignity remained to a woman selling family treasures on the street? She thought of her cold room, of the landlady who had made it clear the rent must be paid promptly, or she would find herself on the street. She thought of the letters she had written to former friends, now unanswered or returned with polite regrets. "You begin tomorrow, 9:00, Solomon said, correctly reading her decision in her face. He slid the pearl across the desk toward her. "Consider this your first payment." As Elizabeth reached for it, he placed his hand over hers, the first time a black man had ever touched her deliberately. His hand was warm, the skin smooth, the gesture both a promise and a warning. "Remember, Mrs. Hargrove, in this office, you answer to me. The past has been reversed. Can you live with that?" Elizabeth withdrew her hand, the pearl clutched tightly in her fingers. "I suppose we shall find out, Mr. Freeman." "Indeed we shall." Solomon rose, signaling the end of the interview. "Miss Taylor will show you out and provide you with the necessary details for tomorrow. Until tomorrow, Mrs. Hargrove." As Elizabeth followed Miss Taylor back to the reception area, she felt Solomon's eyes on her back, measuring her, assessing her value in ways she had once assessed others. The secretary provided her with a small printed card listing the office hours and expectations for employees: punctuality, appropriate dress, discretion. "Mr. Freeman maintains a professional establishment," Miss Taylor explained, her tone suggesting this information was particularly important for Elizabeth to understand. "His clients include some of Philadelphia's most prominent citizens as well as those of more humble circumstances. All are treated with equal respect." The implication was clear. Elizabeth would be expected to do the same, regardless of her Southern beliefs. She nodded her understanding, tucking the card into her purse alongside the pearl. As she left the office and walked down the steps to the street, the weight of the pearl in her palm felt heavier than she remembered, like a small stone marking the grave of her old life. The autumn sun was lower now, the shadows longer. Elizabeth pulled her shawl tighter against the chill and began the long walk back to her rented room, where she would prepare herself for the first day of her new existence, not as Mrs. Thomas Hargrove, mistress of Willow Creek Plantation, but as a simple employee of Solomon Freeman, Esquire, a man who had once been her property, and was now, by every measure that mattered, her superior. The irony was not lost on her, nor was the justice. As she walked through the darkening streets of Philadelphia, Elizabeth wondered which would prove stronger in the days ahead, her pride or her will to survive. Tomorrow would begin to provide the answer. Elizabeth arrived at Freeman and Associates at 8:00 the next morning, having walked the entire distance to save the train fare. The offices were already busy with activity. Miss Taylor glanced up from her desk and nodded toward a small desk positioned near the window in the reception area. "That will be your workspace for now," she said, handing Elizabeth a stack of documents. "Mr. Freeman wants these sorted by county and date. Client names are to be noted separately." Her tone was businesslike, neither friendly nor unfriendly. "There's ink and paper in the drawer." Elizabeth set down her worn purse and removed her shawl. The work seemed simple enough, like clerical organizing. She had managed household accounts for years, but as she began looking at the documents, her hands stopped. These were bills of sale, human beings categorized like livestock. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Hargrove?" Miss Taylor asked, noticing her hesitation. Elizabeth shook her head. No problem." She began sorting the papers, each one a harsh reminder of the system she had once benefited from without question. Mid-morning, Solomon emerged from his office with a white man in an expensive suit. They were laughing about something, clearly on excellent terms. "Judge Patterson, always a pleasure," Solomon said, shaking the man's hand. "Give my regards to your wife." The judge, a federal official, Elizabeth realized with shock, nodded respectfully to Solomon before leaving. Only then did Solomon acknowledge her presence. "Mrs. Hargrove, I see Miss Taylor has put you to work." He checked her progress. "Acceptable. When you finish, join me in my office. We have a client arriving at 11. The client was a woman named Bessie Johnson, perhaps 50, with a respectful manner despite her simple dress. Her hands were rough from work, her expression guarded as she entered Solomon's office. She stopped short at the sight of Elizabeth. "This is Mrs. Hargrove, my new assistant," Solomon explained. "She has experience with plantation record-keeping that may help locate your children." Bessie's eyes narrowed. "She's Virginia," she said, the accent instantly identified. "Own people herself, I expect." "My husband did, yes," Elizabeth admitted, her cheeks burning. "And now she works for me," Solomon said simply. "Mrs. Johnson, please tell us about your children." For the next hour, Elizabeth listened as Bessie described the day her 3 children, ages 12, 9, and 4, had been sold to cover her master's gambling debts. Her youngest hadn't even understood what was happening, clinging to his mother's skirts as the person dragged him away. "I tried to find them after freedom came," Bessie said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "But the master claims he has no records of where they went." "He's lying," Elizabeth said suddenly. Both Solomon and Bessie turned to her. My husband kept a ledger for every sale. Every plantation owner did, for tax purposes, and they would have copies of the bills of sale. Could you testify to that? Solomon asked. Elizabeth hesitated only briefly. Yes, I could. After Bessie left, Solomon studied Elizabeth thoughtfully. You surprised me today. I expected resistance. I'm doing what you've paid me for, Elizabeth replied stiffly. Are you? Solomon leaned forward. Or did Mrs. Johnson's story affect you? 3 children torn from their mother for a gambling debt. Does that seem just to you, even by your Southern standards? Elizabeth looked away. I never approved of separating families. Yet you benefited from a system that did exactly that. Solomon's voice was not blaming, merely stating facts. Interesting, isn't it, how we can disapprove of something while still accepting its results? That evening, walking back to her rented room, Elizabeth found herself thinking not of Solomon's pointed comment, but of Bessie Johnson. How many other Bessies had there been at Willow Creek? How many children sold away? She had never asked, had never wanted to know. Now it seemed she would have to face those questions daily. The thought kept her awake long into the night. The faces of the enslaved people she had once commanded now appeared in her memory, not as background figures, but as individuals with stories, with losses, with grief she had never acknowledged. The most troubling realization came just before sleep claimed her. In helping Solomon find Bessie's children, she had felt, for the first time since arriving in Philadelphia, that her work had a purpose. As weeks passed, Elizabeth settled into a routine at Freeman and Associates. Her desk had been moved to a small space near Solomon's office, a promotion reflecting her growing value to the firm. She no longer merely sorted documents. Now she wrote letters, prepared case notes, and occasionally met with clients when Solomon was busy in court. The work was demanding but fascinating. Each case represented a life broken by the cruelties of slavery, families seeking to be together again, freed men claiming unpaid wages, individuals searching for stolen property or denied inheritance. Elizabeth's deep knowledge of plantation operations proved essential, her testimony helping to win 3 cases already. On a crisp December morning, she arrived to find Solomon reviewing a new case file, his expression unusually troubled. Mrs. Hargrove, do you recall a plantation called Magnolia Hill in Albemarle County? Elizabeth nodded slowly. The Prestons, we attended the same church. Why do you ask? Solomon slid a document across his desk. James Preston is being sued by a former slave named Gabriel. The man claims Preston's daughter, Rebecca, had his child, a daughter who was then sold away at age 6 to hide the relationship. Elizabeth's hand flew to her mouth. Rebecca Preston, but she's unmarried from a good family. Yes, Solomon watched her carefully. The suit seeks to locate the child and establish paternity. If successful, the girl would have a claim to Preston's inheritance. They'll never admit it, Elizabeth said automatically. Even if it's true, the scandal would destroy them. Indeed, Solomon leaned back. Which is why I need you to accompany me to Virginia next week. Your social connections might open doors that would remain closed to me. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. Return to Virginia. I can't. People I knew will see you working for a black attorney. Yes, they will. Solomon's gaze was steady. The question is whether finding this child matters more to you than your former neighbor's good opinion. The journey south was tense. They traveled by train as far as Richmond, where Solomon had arranged a carriage to take them the remaining distance to Charlottesville. Elizabeth sat stiffly beside him, completely aware of the stares they attracted, a white woman and a black man traveling as colleagues, neither servant nor master. In Richmond, they stopped at a small hotel that catered to northern businessmen. That evening, dining in the hotel's small restaurant, Elizabeth noticed a familiar figure entering, Margaret Wilcox, once her closest friend in Richmond society. Elizabeth Hargrove, is that you? Margaret approached, her initial delight fading to confusion as she saw Solomon. We heard you, gone north. Mrs. Wilcox, Elizabeth acknowledged. May I present Solomon Freeman, attorney at law, my employer? Margaret's face showed shock quickly hidden. I see, how interesting. She glanced around nervously. Are you in Richmond long, just passing through? Just passing through, Solomon replied smoothly. Business in Charlottesville. As Margaret hurried away, Elizabeth felt a curious mix of shame and defiance. By morning, everyone in Richmond will know. Solomon sipped his coffee. Does that trouble you? Elizabeth considered the question. Less than I would have expected, she admitted, though I doubt I'll receive any invitations to tea. The next day, as their carriage approached Charlottesville, Elizabeth looked at the familiar landscape with conflicting feelings. The rolling hills, the distant Blue Ridge Mountains. This had been home. Yet it now felt like a foreign country, one where she no longer belonged. At the courthouse, they met resistance from the clerk, who refused to show them records until Elizabeth revealed her identity and connection to local society. Solomon found evidence supporting Gabriel's claim, a record showing the sale of a 6-year-old girl to South Carolina, along with 2 other females. Later, as they left the courthouse with the information they needed, Solomon remarked, "You played that well. I can help you with your next video script or any other task. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more videos."